This morning we're going to be beginning part one of a series on our Unitarian Universalist principles. And because we are multi-generational today, I know we've got a lot of kids in the congregation, and before we get started with this sermon, which might be a little boring to small ears, I want to invite any of our children today, if they would like to come up here at this time, grab a piece of paper, grab some crayons, and I've got a specific little idea for you. You can do whatever you want with it, but my idea is take it and draw a beautiful picture today while I'm talking, and at the end of the service, give that picture to someone special here at the church, someone other than someone you're related to. How about that? So as I prepare to get started here, the front is open for any little hands or little bodies that want to come up and grab a paper and a crayon. And you can come with your parents. You can bring your adult with you if that makes it easier. So as our young ones are coming up to do that, I again reiterate, we're beginning a 7-part sermon series on our Unitarian Universalist 7 principles. So 7 principles on 7 Sundays. Now, I'm not particularly good at math, but if my calculations are correct, I need to cover about 1 principle every Sunday. So today, we are scheduled to address the first principle, but before I get into that, I do want to provide a general overview of all the principles, their place in our faith, and how they came to be. But I warn you, this is going to be the quick and dirty version. So in 1961, the Unitarian Universalist Association, or the UUA, came into existence. The UUA was a merger or a consolidation of the American Unitarian Association, which was established in 1825, and the Universalist Church of America, which was founded in 1793. So in other words, in 1961, that's when the Unitarians and the Universalists got married and became one. To extend that marriage metaphor a little more, the romance between the Unitarians and the Universalists was kind of a long and a stormy one. And the wedding was almost canceled entirely because the two sides couldn't agree on the prenups. A major point of contention was the wording of the original principles and purposes of the union, specifically how to discuss the place of God and our Judeo-Christian heritage in our faith. In spite of the disagreements, a set of purposes and 6 principles were agreed upon. The preamble and original 6 principles, the precursors to our modern-day 7 principles, go a little something like this. In accordance with these corporate purposes, the members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, dedicated to the principles of a free faith, unite in seeking 1, to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship. 2, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. 3, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. 4, to implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace. 5, to serve the needs of member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberal religion. And 6, to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. Curious, how many of you heard the original 6 principles before? We have a few. So now, like all good compromises, these original 6 principles were disliked by everyone. Or at least a lot of people. So it was only a matter of time before they got replaced. So in that way, the UUA's original 6 principles were a bit like the Articles of Confederation of the United States of America. A good first try. The Articles of Confederation lasted about 10 years and were, of course, ultimately replaced by our Constitution, which has served the United States, and which the United States has served for 228 consecutive years. So how did the UUA's original 6 principles come to be replaced by the current 7 principles? Well, like so many good things in life, it started with women. In 1977, the UU Women's Federation got a resolution passed within the UUA requiring the association at every level to, quote, put traditional assumptions and language in perspective and avoid sexist assumptions and language in the future. Now, 2 years after that resolution was adopted, a UU Conference of Women looked squarely at the original 6 principles and saw massive problems vis-a-vis its blatantly sexist language among its other problems. You heard some of it, right? Man, brotherhood. So then in 1981, a non-sexist revision of the principles was crafted by various women's groups and presented at the UU General Assembly. It caused a stir. It got sent to committee. The committee sent questionnaires to our congregations. Data was collected. The committee redrafted with surprisingly few changes. A new draft was circulated in 1983, more changes made. A final draft was submitted at General Assembly in 1984 and was actually adopted by a wide margin. Then, per our UUA bylaws, the new principles had to be voted on a second time in 1985, at which point they passed almost unanimously with only one dissenting vote. Now, if you ask me, my theory is that the dissenting vote was cast by a UU humanist. I say this because we all know that for Unitarian Universalists to vote unanimously on anything, let alone something this important, that would be an honest-to-God miracle. So clearly it had to be a humanist who cast the dissenting vote in order to, put an end to all of that nonsense. That, in a nutshell, is how we came to have our modern 7 principles. But our principles, though we often speak of them as such, are not an isolated text. They were never designed to act like a set of UU 10 commandments. Our 7 principles are part of our associational covenant, the covenant that binds together UU congregations and outlines how each congregation chooses to live in relationship with other congregations. So in other words, technically, no individual member here has been bound to uphold these principles. Rather, our congregation, UUCJ, has agreed to affirm these principles in our relationship with other UU congregations, which together comprise our Unitarian Universalist Association. That associational covenant is part of our UUA bylaws, specifically Section 2. Show of hands. How many people in here have read all of the UUA bylaws? Exactly. Not a bad thing. You are right to have not read the UUA bylaws because like all bylaws, they are boring. Now, they're all very good and important, but also a bit boring, except, in my humble opinion, Section 2. Section 2 is entitled Principles and Purposes. It is our associational covenant, and it is so important and so beautiful that I would actually like to read it to you this morning in its entirety. In many ways, this text is the heartbeat of our association. Article 2, Principles and Purposes, Section C-2.1, Principles. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. The living tradition which we share draws from many sources. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Words and deeds of prophetic women and men, which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. Wisdom from the world's religions, which inspire us in our ethical and spiritual life. Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions, which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. Grateful for the religious pluralism, which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support. Section C 2.2, Purposes. The Unitarian Universalist Association shall devote its resources to and exercise its corporate powers for religious, educational, and humanitarian purposes. The primary purpose of the association is to serve the needs of its member congregations, organize new congregations, extend and strengthen Unitarian Universalist institutions, and implement its principles. Section C 2.3, Inclusion. Systems of power, privilege, and oppression have traditionally created barriers for persons and groups with particular identities, ages, abilities, and histories. We pledge to replace such barriers with ever-widening circles of solidarity and mutual respect. We strive to be an association of congregations that truly welcome all persons and commit to structuring congregational and associational life in ways that empower and enhance everyone's participation. And finally, Section C 2.4, Freedom of Belief. Nothing herein shall be deemed to infringe upon the individual freedom of belief, which is inherent in the Universalist and Unitarian heritages, or to conflict with any statement of purpose, covenant, or bond of union used by any congregation unless such is used as a creedal test. So that is the history and the greater context of our 7 principles. Now, even though the principles were adopted by a near unanimous vote in 1985, that doesn't mean that everyone in our faith actually likes the principles. There are several people, including leaders of our faith and ministers, who don't really like the principles at all. And I am one of them. It's not that I disagree with anything they say. I just have a few concerns about them, similar concerns shared by many. For instance, I personally fear that the principles are a little too vague. So we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. But who is a person? Is a corporation a person? Is a zygote a person? Without more narrow definitions, I fear the principles do little to distinguish us from any other church or organization. Now, in addition to being too broad, I fear the principles can also be too narrow. They don't capture the fullness, perhaps not even the core of our faith. Now, over a decade ago, former UUA president, the Reverend Bill Sinkford, noted the following: we have in our principles an affirmation of our faith which uses not one single piece of religious language, not one. Not even one word that would be considered traditionally religious. And that is a wonderment to me. I wonder whether this kind of language can adequately capture who we are and what we're about. Noticeably absent from the principles are words such as God, the divine, prayer, worship, faith, hope, love. How can the 7 principles capture the heart and spirit of Unitarian Universalism when they don't even contain the word love? Don't get me wrong, the 7 principles have great value to us as a people, but they are not the core of our faith tradition. They comprise the lowest common denominator of our faith, the floor, not the hearth, not the ceiling, not the highest spire. but every building needs a floor. One final concern I have with our principles. There is always a danger associated with verbal formulas. They ossify quickly and thus become sacred cows. Whenever that happens, I believe that we Unitarian Universalists especially have a moral and religious duty to take out those sacred cows and make holy hamburgers. And now we will devote the next 6 weeks to studying these principles. In the very limited time I have this morning, I want to give you 3 brief reflections that I have regarding our first principle, the first principle in which we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. 1, the first principle does not necessarily mean that everyone has equal value. Certainly you can believe that if you like. It's not a bad position to take, but it's not actually what this principle says. This principle, more fundamentally, declares that every person has a certain value, non-transferable, inalienable at their core. That value comes by simple virtue of being a human being. And that core, that minimum level of worth and dignity, can never be lost, no matter what, because it's every person's birthright as a child of creation. And from this inalienable core of worth flow certain possibilities. For example, the possibility of unconditional love for all. See, if you don't believe that every person has at their core that inherent worth that can never be diminished, then I'm not so sure that unconditional love for all is rational. Another possibility that flows from our first principle is the possibility of hope for all. Our Universalist forebears believed that no person, no matter what they did or believed, was worthy of being punished eternally in hell. Now, whether we each individually today believe in an afterlife or not, we modern-day UUs continue to hold hope that every person ultimately can find redemption, whatever that word might mean to you. It is this hope undergirded by our first principle that has led many UUs to fight against the death penalty, for instance, or to advocate for restorative justice instead of punitive justice, or to fight to end homelessness. A second point. The first principle is not a justification to act like a jerk. Too often, the first principle is brandished about by UUs who like to use it to defend themselves, or rather defend selfish and jerky behavior. For example, let's say someone has acted in a way outside the bounds of our congregational covenant. How dare you reprimand me? What of my inherent worth and dignity? Or when someone gets upset at a committee meeting, I have inherent worth and dignity. Therefore, my objectively terrible idea deserves just as much consideration as these objectively better and more reasonable ideas. Now, thankfully, I have not actually heard this application of the first principle much at this church. But as someone who has worked as a consultant with our association, I can tell you that there are many tales of these kinds of applications of the first principle. I think it betokens an unhealthy strain of radical individualism within our faith. Now, on the Unitarian side of our family, we have the Transcendentalists, and we should very much be proud of their heritage. But, to be honest, the Transcendentalists also help to propagate this idea of radical individualism. It's embedded in the works of Thoreau and Emerson, and it can sometimes work against our desire to build the beloved community. And in that regard, we must beware using the first principle as a proof text to excuse giving preference to the needs and desires of the one over the needs and desires of the many. A third and final point. All that said, the first principle is not primarily a commandment simply to be nice to others. I sometimes hear UUs use the first principle as a general encouragement toward being nice and polite to everybody. As in, oh, I feel terrible that I yelled at that guy for cutting me off on the interstate this morning. I really failed to affirm his inherent worth and dignity. I've actually heard permutations of that said by real people. At its core, Recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person isn't so much about being nice and polite to everyone we meet. Actually, I would say that the first principle often requires us to be the opposite of nice and polite, specifically and especially when it comes to confronting the establishment, standing against the values of the empire, tearing down systems of oppression that by their very existence serve to deny the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The values embedded in our first principle are the values that inspired the suffragettes to march and protest for the rights of women. The values underlying our first principle are what inspired the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other black leaders to protest and boycott and courageously break the law in order to bring civil rights and liberation to people of color in this country. It is our first principle that led so many of you to write emails to our city council, to attend mayoral town halls, to wait for hours just to make a statement before our elected public servants to ensure legal protections for the LGBTQ community here in Jacksonville. That is the core and the central power of our first principle. I'm really incredibly happy that we got to discuss the first principle on this Sunday following the passage of the HRO. As I said earlier, 5 years ago, our city leaders affirmatively declared that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans folks did not deserve to be treated the same as everyone else. The LGBTQ community of Jacksonville, allies of that community, this church, we all worked together for 5 years to right that wrong. We did so because each of us, UU or otherwise, we each believed in our heart of hearts that the inherent worth and dignity of every person deserved to be recognized in the city of Jacksonville. This recent victory is a testimony of the power of our faith, and so I want to thank each of you for your work and support in this victory. And I look forward to the victories that are yet to come. And rest assured, by the power of this faith, so long as we continue to keep this faith, those victories will come. Amen, and blessed be.